The air in the Special Operations Command briefing room at Fort Carson was sterile, rarefied, and cold, an artificial controlled echo of the brutality that awaited him outside. General Marcus Davies, a man whose face seemed to have been carved by the wind and frost of 1,000 winters in forgotten theaters of war, spoke with a surgical precision that dissected reality into cold, objective facts. His voice was a deep baritone that allowed for no interruptions, a sound that filled the room without ever rising. On the polished metal table, a digital projector cast the image of 5 smiling faces, a vacation photo of a family named Miller. They seemed the quintessence of the American dream, tanned and happy, completely oblivious to their new status as a military enigma. First Sergeant Ethan Walker maintained his rigid posture, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed not on the photograph, but on the general's face. Walker was a scout, a tracker, a ghost who moved through terrain where other men got lost and died. He read the land as others read a book, and his resume was a long list of inhospitable places and successful missions that would never be made public. He was the tool the Army used when it needed to find something, or someone, that didn't want to be found. 5 civilians, Sergeant, Davies began, his gaze scanning the dossier before him. Arthur Miller, 48, his wife, Catherine, 46, their children, Liam, 17, and Sophie, 15, and Arthur's brother, Benjamin Miller, 42. They set out for a week-long hike in a remote section of the Rocky Mountains National Park, near the Canadian border. They were experienced, well-equipped. Their last contact via satellite phone was 72 hours ago. Since then, absolute silence. The park patrol attempted an aerial search, but the weather forced them to retreat. A blizzard, Walker, the likes of which hasn't been seen in decades, is settling over the entire range. Civilian command has requested our assistance. They need the best, and that, Sergeant, is you. There was something in the general's tone, a subtle emphasis, a calculated omission that set off a silent alarm in Walker's mind. This was not a simple search and rescue operation. The military didn't get involved for lost hikers, not at this level. He looked at the topographic map on the screen. The search area was a tangle of tight contour lines, a knot of peaks, valleys, and canyons that most maps simply labeled impassable, and in the corner a code name that gave him a chill. Operation White Silence. The irony was palpable. The silence in the mountains was never white. It was gray and howling, the sound of nature's indifference. White silence was what came after, the silence of a snow shroud over the dead. "Understood, sir," Walker replied, his own voice a calm counterpoint to the gravity of the room. He asked no questions. Questions were a weakness, an admission that the information provided was not enough. His job was to make the information sufficient. The helicopter ride in the Black Hawk was a violent dance with the atmosphere. The blades cut through the dense air, heavy with ice crystals. The sound a desperate mechanical heartbeat against the growing fury of the storm. Below them, the world dissolved into a monochromatic abstraction. Mountain peaks as sharp as shards of glass tore at a sky the color of lead. The vast and ancient pine forests were bowed under the weight of a blanket of snow that seemed intent on crushing the world itself. Walker sat by the open door, the safety harness the only thing separating him from the white abyss. He let the icy wind whip his face, feeling the spray of ice on his eyelashes. It was a way of attuning himself to the environment, of becoming part of it before his feet even touched the ground. The cold was an honest adversary. It told you exactly how it was going to kill you. Outpost Boreas was an insult to the majesty of the landscape. A few prefabricated structures, battered by the wind, huddled together like frightened animals. A communications antenna, coated in ice, seemed to plead with the gray heavens. A barbed wire fence, half buried in snow, offered the pathetic illusion of security against an immensity that could not be contained. When the helicopter landed, the rotor wash created a momentary whiteout. For an instant, the outpost disappeared. When the snow settled, it revealed a scene of desolation. Walker jumped into the deep snow, his body absorbing the impact with years of practice. The man who received him was First Lieutenant Calloway, a young officer whose face had not yet been hardened by reality, but whose eyes held the haunted look of a veteran. Fear was a subtle mist that emanated from him and every other soldier at the post. They moved with a lethargy that was not laziness, but the weight of constant anxiety. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in murmurs, as if they were afraid the mountain would hear them. There was more fear than discipline in that place. and Walker knew immediately that the blizzard was not the only thing tormenting them. "Welcome to Boreas, Sergeant," Calloway said, his voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "We've put you up in barracks, Charlie. The conditions are basic." Walker ignored the offer. His gaze swept over the walls of granite and ice that encircled the post. "I'm not here to sleep, Lieutenant. I want a full debrief of the last patrol that went out. I want maps, weather logs, and all the coffee you have." That night, Walker did not sleep. He studied the maps, overlaying the Miller family's GPS logs with wind currents and snow accumulation patterns. The wind beat against the thin walls of his room, an incessant drumming. It sounded like fingers scratching at the metal, trying to get in. He could feel the psychological pressure of the isolation weighing on the base. An invisible enemy more dangerous than any storm. Before dawn, with the world still wrapped in a blue and gray twilight, he set out, alone. The company of frightened soldiers would be a liability. The snow fell ceaselessly, a thick veil that muffled sound and blurred distances. The world was a white cocoon, and Walker moved through it with the silent grace of a wolf. His breath was the only disturbance, a cloud of vapor that rose and dissipated before him. He wasn't just looking, he was listening with his eyes, feeling the vibrations of the terrain through the soles of his boots. He searched for anomalies, for anything that broke the pattern of nature. He found them in the third hour of his patrol, in a sheltered clearing, where the wind had not managed to completely erase the history of the ground. There were footprints, human. He knelt, his heart beating a slow, methodical rhythm. They were from high-quality hiking boots. The stride was firm, the spacing regular. Whoever made them wasn't running, wasn't panicking. They were walking with a clear purpose. But the direction was a screaming alarm in Walker's brain. The tracks didn't follow a trail. They didn't head towards a valley or a shelter. They went up, directly into a narrow canyon that, on Walker's maps, was marked as a dead end, a rock trap. An even greater oddity sent a shiver down his spine. He scanned the visible length of the tracks. There was only one set, a single pair of boots, moving with relentless determination towards nothing. Where were the other 4 people? He considered the possibilities. Had they walked in a single file, stepping in the exact same footprints to conserve energy? Unlikely, given the deep snow and uneven terrain. Had one person carried the other 4? Impossible. Logic, his most reliable compass, was failing him. He followed the trail. Entering the canyon was like entering the throat of a beast. The dark granite walls, streaked with veins of ice, rose hundreds of feet on either side, seeming to lean inward, blocking out the gray sky. The wind, funneled through the narrow corridor, howled and moaned with a mournful voice, as if telling tales of lost souls. The sound of his own boots on the snow seemed profanely loud. And then, the world stopped. The tracks, so clear and defined a moment before, simply ended. They didn't fade. They didn't scatter. They walked to a point in the middle of the canyon, about 10 feet from a snow-covered rock wall, and then emptiness. Nothing. As if the person had been hoisted into the sky by an invisible wire. Walker stood motionless, his tracker's brain fighting the data his eyes were providing. It was a violation of the laws of physics. He swept the surrounding area with a forensic gaze. The snow was pristine, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no rope marks, no tracks of an animal large enough to carry a man. Nothing, just the footprints that led to oblivion. His hand, out of pure reflex, went to the Sig Sauer pistol in his holster. He approached the rock wall slowly, his instincts screaming that the end of the trail and the wall were connected. There was something wrong with the way the snow had accumulated at the base of the rock. It looked artificially smooth. He took off his gloves, and the biting cold stung his bare skin. With his fingers, he began to brush away the snow. Under the soft layer, there was hard ice, and under the ice, his fingers touched something even colder, harder, and smoother than any rock. Metal. Adrenaline surged through his body. He took out his ice axe and began to chip at the surface with careful, precise strikes. Shards of ice flew, glittering in the frigid air. Slowly, painfully, a shape began to emerge. A perfect vertical line, a seam, then a massive hinge, corroded by time. He worked with a feverish intensity, his breath coming in plumes of vapor, until there was no doubt left. Embedded in the face of the mountain, hidden under layers of snow and ice and decades of forgetfulness, was a gate, a colossal gate of reinforced steel, sealed and silent. The footprints ended before it. The person had walked to this impossible gate and vanished. Walker felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the primal fear of the unknown, the feeling of having pulled a loose thread in the tapestry of reality and feeling the entire universe beginning to unravel. Back at Outpost Boreas, his discovery was met with a shocked silence. Calloway stared at the digital photos on Walker's camera as if he were looking at proof of heresy. That can't be there," he stammered. "There's nothing on the maps. Officially, that area has been solid rock since creation. Reality doesn't seem to care much for your maps." "Lieutenant," Walker retorted, "I want access to all files, classified or not, on any military construction in this region. Everything. Cold War projects, listening posts, fallout shelters. Whatever you have." The night turned into a ghost hunt through dusty digital archives, and that's when he found it. An encrypted file, buried under layers of bureaucracy, titled Project Deep Winter. It was a top-secret project from the 1960s, a network of self-sufficient underground facilities designed to serve as command and listening posts in the event of a total nuclear war. Most had been dismantled at the end of the Cold War, but a few, the most remote and secret, were simply sealed, their records erased, left to rot in the frozen belly of the mountains. And then, on a list of engineering personnel involved in the construction of Site Gamma, the designation for Walker's location. A name made his blood run cold. Sergeant Michael Walker. His father. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The memories came in fragmented, painful flashes. His father, a quiet and distant man, who returned from the army with a shadow in his eyes that never left. The long hours he spent staring out the window during snowstorms, not seeing the suburban landscape, but something much, much farther away and colder. His enigmatic words, spoken one night after a nightmare. "There are things buried under the ice, Ethan. Things that sing to themselves in the dark. It's better to let them sleep." The mission was no longer professional. It became a pilgrimage, an exhumation of his own father's soul. His personal ghosts and the mystery of the Millers had merged into a single, terrifying question. What was behind that gate? The tension at the post reached a breaking point when Walker announced his intention to excavate and breach the gate. Calloway, now visibly terrified, was constantly on the radio with command, his voice an urgent whisper. But it was the reaction of the other soldiers that solidified the atmosphere of dread. They refused to return to the canyon. It was Corporal Reyes, a young man from Denver whose grandparents were Ute, who finally gave voice to the fear that was poisoning them. "My ancestors spoke of this mountain. Sergeant," he said, his voice low and trembling. "They called it the Silent Heart. They said it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence that listens. They spoke of lights that danced on the peaks on starless nights, of voices carried on the wind that weren't human. They said the mountain guarded something, or imprisoned something. To go there and knock on its door, it's madness." Walker looked at the tired, frightened faces around him. He saw the conflict between their training and their primal superstition. "This isn't about legends, Corporal," Walker said, his voice as hard as the ice outside. "This is about 5 missing people, and I'm not going anywhere until I know what happened to them." But in the back of his own mind, his father's words echoed Reyes's legends, things that sing to themselves in the dark. The final order came through an encrypted channel, directly from Davies. "Sergeant Walker, your mission is terminated. The search has been officially called off. The Millers have been declared victims of the storm. Return to base immediately. That is a direct order." The message was clear. It was a cover-up. They didn't want the gate opened. They knew it was there. Walker looked at the radio, then at the mountain peaks barely visible through the falling snow. His career, his life of obedience and duty, was on one side of the line. On the other side was the truth, his father's legacy, and the unknown fate of 5 people. He picked up the radio. "Understood. General, the static is getting worse. I lost your last transmission." He turned off the device and turned to Calloway, who looked at him with a mixture of terror and awe. "Lieutenant, gather any men who have the courage. We're going to open that door." The excavation was an act of defiance against the mountain and against command. A small team, won over by Walker's steely determination, worked under the beams of their headlamps, the world reduced to the small circle of light and the panting sound of their breaths. The metal of shovels scraping against hidden concrete sounded like sacrilege in that profound silence. They discovered that the gate was just the face of a much larger structure. A complex of concrete and steel plunged into the mountain like a stake through a giant's heart. Finally, after hours of brutal work, they managed to place a small breaching charge on the corroded lock. The explosion was a dull, heavy thud, which the snow swallowed almost instantly. A long, high-pitched groan of metal surrendering after half a century of silence followed. With the combined effort of 4 men, the massive gate screeched inward, opening a sliver of absolute darkness. A gust of stale, incredibly cold air that smelled of ozone, damp metal, and stagnant time rushed out, making them recoil. Walker was the first to enter, his flashlight cutting a solitary beam into the palpable darkness. A metal corridor stretched before him, its walls coated in a thin layer of frost that glittered like diamond dust. The silence in here was different. It was not the silence of nature. It was an artificial, pressurized silence, the silence of a tomb. They advanced, their boots echoing strangely in the hallway. The corridor opened into a circular control room, consoles of obsolete equipment with cathode ray screens and reels of magnetic tape were arranged in silent arcs. Papers and documents were scattered on the floor, as if people had left in a hurry. On one terminal, a green light blinked rhythmically, a ghostly heartbeat in the dead heart of the facility. It was there that Walker found it. On a clipboard, a recent entry log, the names of the 5 Millers. But next to their names were not their ages, but their credentials. Dr. Arthur Miller, theoretical physicist. Dr. Catherine Miller, exobiologist. Benjamin Miller, cryptographic engineer. They weren't tourists, they were a scientific team. They had come to reopen this place. Haunted by the discovery, Walker approached the still blinking terminal. He managed to access the last entry in the operations log, dated 1 week ago. The words glowed in phosphor green on the dark screen, a message in a digital bottle. The source has been reactivated. The signal is stronger than anticipated. Containment is failing. The silence, white silence, isn't the absence of sound. It is a sound, a frequency that responds. They heard us. Oh God, they're... The entry ended abruptly. Walker stepped back, a cold horror taking hold of him. He returned to the entrance of the complex, to the threshold between 2 worlds. The snow was falling heavier than ever, a thick white veil threatening to seal the entrance forever. The open gate was a dark mouth exhaling an ancient, terrible secret. He had found his answers, but they were answers to questions he never knew existed. The Millers hadn't gotten lost. They had found something, or something had found them. Project Deep Winter wasn't a listening post to spy on the Russians. It was a listening post aimed in another direction, up, or maybe down. He stood there on the border, with the howl of the wind at his back and the pressurized silence of the tomb before him. He understood his father now. He understood the shadow in his eyes, his fixation with the snow. His father hadn't just sealed a bunker. He had tried to bury a nightmare, and now Walker had unearthed it. The snow fell, muffling the world, creating an absolute white silence. But it was no longer an empty silence. It was full, filled with the memory of the Millers, with the ghost of his father, and with the terrifying promise of whatever was singing to itself in the darkness of the mountain. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same, not because he had found answers, but because he had crossed an invisible threshold that many, including his own father, had only ever peered across. He looked one last time at the fading storm, and then, with cold resolve, he turned and stepped into the darkness, into the heart of the white silence. The snow continued to fall, slowly covering his tracks, erasing his existence from the world above, as the mountain finally began to close its wound.